You believe that what hurts you comes from outside, but what if I told you that the wound has always been inside you? That what you call demotivation may just be the first whisper of your soul trying to speak for the first time? I faced my shadow. I dove deep into the abyss of my pain. I relived traumas. I dismantled masks. I healed wounds I didn't even know were still bleeding. I did everything they say you need to do to heal, and in the end, I was left feeling empty. No spirit, no drive, no direction. But worst of all, no explanation. It wasn't sadness. It was silence, a pause that seemed endless, a total absence of will, as if something inside me had simply shut down. That's when I asked myself, am I broken? Did I go too far in this process? Or is this silence actually a sign that something is finally right? Carl Jung wrote that the dissolution of the persona is often confused with depression, and that's when it all started to make sense. For years, my life was driven by invisible mechanisms: fear of not being good enough, need for acceptance, compulsion to prove my worth. And when those unconscious engines were turned off, only what was real remained, or rather, what was yet to be born. This is not the kind of healing that culture values. There is no immediate glory here, no applause. Here there is only silence, and no one prepares you for it. They talk about trauma, about triggers, about collapse, but never about what happens after. When everything that drove you no longer makes sense, when success seems empty, when the future doesn't excite you, when what was urgent no longer presses. Jung called this Negredo, the dark night of the soul, the symbolic decomposition of the old self, the liminal space between who you were and who you are becoming. And that space is disconcerting, because it's not about not knowing what to do. It's about no longer wanting to do anything that wants to find you. This video is for those who are in that space, for those who have healed but don't recognize themselves, for those who did everything right but now only feel empty. Here, I don't promise quick answers, but I do promise one thing: you are not alone. If this silence is yours too, stay with me, because what seems like the end may be exactly where your real life begins. For weeks, I woke up with that familiar feeling of absence. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't despair. It was as if everything had been erased, as if someone had pulled the plug on my soul. The dreams that once moved me now seemed like posters for a movie that no longer moved me. The plans, the goals, the commitments, everything was still there, but like a stage set abandoned after the play has ended. At first, I tried to fight it. I forced myself to act, to keep going, to pretend that everything was normal. But the harder I tried, the more I felt like I was pushing an empty shell, as if the engine that once drove me had been dismantled. And in a way, it had. Working with the shadow has this side effect that no one mentions. It doesn't just heal, it dismantles. Everything that motivated you before, the fear of failure, the desire to be seen, the desperate need to please, disappears. And what's left is a silence that echoes in every corner of your identity. This silence is disturbing because we are not used to it. We live in a culture that reveres the noise of productivity, that applauds you for being busy, for doing more, for never stopping. But when silence appears, no one teaches you to listen to it. Everyone wants to get you out of it as quickly as possible, as if the pause were a defect, a system error. But Jung knew better. He understood that this silence is the point of change. He called it the liminal space, the interval between the death of the old self and the birth of the new. It is a crossing, not a collapse, a sacred space, not a failure. I resisted, of course. I wanted to run away, speed up, feel something again. But my psyche, wiser than my will, refused to cooperate with the old formulas. It knew that if I went back to being driven by fear, I would just be repeating patterns in a new outfit. And what I needed was not a new disguise, but a new truth. I began to realize that this lack of motivation was not an obstacle, but a filter, a profound process of purification. Everything that was false was being drained away. Everything that was a mask was dissolving. My soul, for the first time in a long time, was silent, not because it had given up, but because it was about to speak. And that voice, when it emerged, would change everything. The hardest part of going through this emptiness is not the absence of will, it is the absence of identity. Everything I had based my life on, my career, my relationships, The desires I had nurtured so fervently suddenly seemed to belong to someone else, and, in a way, they did. They were pieces built to sustain a version of me that was now quietly dying. It's not just about changing dreams, it's about seeing with brutal clarity that many of those dreams were never mine. They were unconscious strategies, programmed to avoid abandonment, to disguise shame, to gain approval. The mask I had worn for years was falling apart, and with it, the entire system of motivations that kept me functioning. It was in this state that I first heard David's name, a successful architect, respected, disciplined, admired, someone who had also delved into shadow work, who had dug deep into his oldest pains. And like me, he emerged with an uncomfortable clarity. He no longer fit into his own life. David told me that he used to work 60 hours a week, driven by an anxiety he called ambition. He dreamed of goals, promotions, recognition, and after the cure, it all seemed like noise. He told me, "I look at the same goals and feel nothing. It's as if they were drawn by a stranger." Modern medicine would have called it depression, but I knew, as Jung knew, that it was something else. It wasn't a lack of energy, but a lack of falsehood. The ego's fuel was gone, and the engine of the self was not yet running. It was a silent journey, a kind of mourning for a life that seemed bright, but wasn't real. That's when I understood. Real motivation doesn't come from urgency. It comes from truth, and truth doesn't shout. It whispers. We only hear it when everything else is quiet. Fear moves. It moves a lot. It is efficient, fierce, almost heroic, but fear also takes its toll. It drags us down, but it consumes us. And when that fear is finally deactivated, when we stop fearing failure, abandonment, invisibility, we lose what drove us. And what is left? Nothing. A sacred nothingness. In that nothingness, I began to realize that silence was not empty. It was space. Space for something that has not yet been born, but that can only be born if I resist the temptation to fill it with more of the same. The soul does not run. It waits. And in that waiting, it prepares the ground where the true self can finally flourish. David did not have an epiphany. There was no light from the sky or sudden revelation. It was something more subtle, more organic. One day, without knowing why, he started walking. Long walks with no goal, no destination, no plan. They weren't exercise. They were silent rituals. It was as if his body knew what his mind couldn't yet understand, that he needed space, breath, presence. During one of these walks, he noticed an old, forgotten, half-ruined building. He had passed it hundreds of times, but only on that day did he really see it. It was as if the building had been there waiting, invisible until the right eyes were ready to see it. There was dignity in the decay. There was history in that abandoned structure. There was beauty where no one else saw it. David began to visit it often, not in a hurry, not with the intention of doing something, just being there. He took a notebook and drew. They weren't architectural designs. They were impressions, sensations, whispers captured on paper. And over time, that silent connection began to take shape, not in words, in direction. That's how I understood what Jung called the emergence of the self. It's not a scream, it's not an order, it's a buzz, light, insistent, like a sustained note in the background that begins to vibrate inside your chest. The first time we feel it, our rational mind wants to shut it down. It wants to know the reason, the purpose, the usefulness, but the self cannot be explained. It simply invites us. And when we accept that invitation, even without understanding, something opens up. Something begins to live within us. It is not enthusiasm. It is not euphoria. It is a kind of restless peace, a calm movement, without urgency, but one that can no longer be ignored. What touched me about David's story was not the building, nor the restoration project that would follow. It was the way it all began, without a plan, without haste, without ego, just listening, just willing to let something true reveal itself in its own time. I began to apply this principle to myself, not forcing clarity, just being available for it, not pushing time, just respecting it. And slowly, I noticed small pulsations, curiosities I had previously ignored, moments of peace in unexpected places. An invisible thread began to pull me toward something that didn't yet have a name, but that, for the first time in a long time, made sense to feel. The self does not roar, it hums. That phrase haunted me for weeks, because I was expecting thunder, a scream, a crack. I was expecting motivation as I knew it, urgent, loud, flammable. But what I felt was something else. It was more like a frequency, a sound that you don't hear with your ears, but with your whole body. This buzzing doesn't demand attention. It offers invitations. It invites me to look more carefully at what I normally ignore, to touch with presence what I used to handle with haste, to finally listen to what has always been trying to speak. And that's when everything changes. Motivation ceases to be a battle against resistance and becomes resonance. I no longer chase achievements to prove something. I no longer move out of fear of being forgotten. Instead, I follow the vibration of what touches me silently, what arouses curiosity, reverence, admiration, without logic, without the need for justification. Sarah, the woman I met in a therapy group, went through the same process. For years, she had been a marketing executive, and for years, she performed admirably, driven, of course, by fear. Fear of being inadequate, fear of losing her mother's love, fear of not being noticed. Working with her shadow dismantled this, and what was left was silence. The same silence I knew so well. In the midst of this silence, she began spending time with children. No professional intention, no career plan, just presence. There, she discovered that something was coming to life inside her, something that didn't need a strategy to make sense. In 2 years, she left marketing and became an elementary school teacher, not to escape, out of loyalty. This is the paradox that my old self would never understand. This new motivation, softer, more subtle, quieter, accomplishes more, because it doesn't consume, it doesn't exhaust, it doesn't hurt. It builds from the truth and is therefore sustainable. Jung called this living symbolically. It is not living on illusions, but living connected to deeper meanings, meaningful coincidences, synchronicities. When I connect to the self, work becomes devotion, relationships become conscious choices, creation ceases to be performance and becomes expression, rest ceases to be guilt and becomes nourishment, limits cease to seem selfish and become self-care. It is no longer about controlling life, it is about collaborating with it. When you live motivated by truth, each step is not a race. It is a dance with what is real. It took me a while to understand, but today I know with clarity. I haven't lost my motivation. I've just overcome the reasons that used to keep me going. And that's not failure, it's maturity. It's the moment when the soul refuses to keep running after something that isn't true, when you're no longer satisfied with applause, awards, or the smoothing over of social expectations, when you demand authenticity, not as a performance but as a starting point. The old life, driven by lack, by the need to prove, by the hunger for approval, is over. And that doesn't mean the end. It means the beginning of real life, of a life aligned with the self, of a life that moves not out of fear, but out of truth. Jung never said that the process of individuation would be easy. He never promised it would be comfortable. What he did guarantee was that it would be real, that it would be worth it. That on the other side of deconstruction, there was something that no productivity manual can offer: meaning. The motivation that comes from truth doesn't burn out. It illuminates. It doesn't lead to exhaustion, because it doesn't come from lack. It doesn't leave you empty, because it doesn't take more than it gives. It doesn't disappear when the world falls apart, because it's rooted in who you are, not what you do. If you are currently in limbo, in a void, in a nameless pause, maybe there is nothing wrong with you. Maybe something is, in fact, finally right. Maybe it is your soul that, after so long, is strong enough to stop presenting itself. Maybe it is ready to speak with your voice, and not the one you were taught to use. That silence that scares, confuses, and irritates. It is the comma between the life you have lived so far and the life you were meant to live. A life in which motivation is not fuel to resist chaos, but an inner flame that quietly warms you. A life in which you don't have to run to be someone, because you finally recognize that you already are. If something here really touched you, if you felt that this silence is also yours, then do the following. Support this channel with any amount. It is this gesture that allows us to continue creating content like this, which speaks to your pain without disguise, and to your truth without haste. And if you want to continue the journey with me, subscribe now and activate the bell, because this conversation about what it really means to become who you are is just beginning.